Hey everyone, Nelson here from Prior to Bicycles. Nothing ruins your ride like getting a flat on your bike. What's worse is if there's no bike shop or anyone else around to help you. So today I'm going to show you how to do a flat fix on both the front and the rear wheel on your E-Classic Plus.
We recommend that any repairs that are done on your bike be done by a professional mechanic. If you choose to follow this video and repair the bike yourself, we suggest taking it down to your local bike shop for a safety check afterwards.
So let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to do this flat. I've got here one of the 174 Hudson saddlebags. Let's open this up, take some of our tools out. We'll need a 15mm wrench, a 10mm wrench, 5mm Allen key, a 4mm Allen key, some tire levers to remove the tire, your inner tube. In this case, it's a 700 by 38C inner tube with a Schrader valve, and something to inflate your tires, such as a small hand pump, a CO2 cartridge, and a CO2 head, or a floor pump. If you get a flat while riding, your first steps should always be safety. If you notice you have a flat, you want to move over to the shoulder of the road or maybe the sidewalk so you can do this repair that we're going to be showing you. Once you're in a safe area, let's take a look to see which tire is flat. The most obvious is if the tire is completely airless, but if you're not too sure, you can always just squeeze the tire to see which one feels firm or which one feels deflated. Before we get started, let's power down the bike by holding the power button until the display turns off. Now let's disconnect the motor wire from the wheel and the frame. Let's grab both ends of the connection here and pull straight out. Then, using your 15mm wrench, let's loosen the axle nuts on the front wheel. Make sure to do this on both sides of the wheel. From here, let's just loosen these axle nuts just a little bit more so that the washers can move around. We're going to lift the front end of the bike and slide the wheel out. And then we're going to gently place the front end of the bike on the ground. Like so. With the wheel off the bike, we can now inspect the tire to make sure that there's nothing poking out of it, such as glass or a piece of metal. Let's start at the valve hole, and then we'll just want to go around the tire, just inspecting the tread here. And again, we're looking for anything that could have punctured this to cause your flat. Once you get back to the valve, we've done one full rotation, and again, if we see something, we'll remove it. If not, we can move on to the next step. If there's still a little bit air inside the tire, we want to completely deflate that. So let's remove the valve cap. And using your finger or a small tool, we're going to deflate the tire. Press down on the tire to just help squeeze all that air out. Now, let's grab our tire levers. We'll want to start opposite of the valve, so we'll go down here. And because there's a reflector here, I'm just going to go over to this spoke here. So with our tire lever, we want to use this hooked section here underneath the bead of the tire, and this section here will go onto the spoke. So let's pinch the tire here, and you should be able to see the rim strip when doing this. Then, using the hook section of the tire lever, we're going to go inside between the rim and the tire, and we're going to put this underneath the tire bead. Make sure you only grab one side when doing this. Then use the other side of the tire lever and attach it to the spoke. Then using your second tire lever, we're just going to go about a spoke or two over, and then we're going to do the same thing. Pinch the tire, put the hook of the tire lever in between the rim and the tire, and then we're going to roll that out. For this second tire lever, we're not going to hook it onto the spoke. Instead, we're going to go along the tire to remove this side. With the tire bead off on one side, we're going to go inside of the tire, grab the inner tube, and then pull it out. To remove the last section of the inner tube, we're going to pinch the tire, pull it up, and then move it off to the side, and then slide the inner tube upward. With the inner tube out of the tire, we're going to set the wheel off to the side. We're going to grab our inflation device, in our case, a floor pump. We're going to pump this up until the inner tube has a little bit more form. This will allow us to see and hear the air escape the inner tube. This should be enough, but in some cases you might need to put a little bit more air in the inner tube. Then I'm going to hold my hand kind of in a C grip, and I'm going to move it along the inner tube. And again, I'm trying to hear and even feel, using my hand, any air escape the tube. Once I've found where the hole is, I can then patch it up or replace the inner tube. But what I want to know is how far is that hole away from the valve? Then we're going to go to our tire and inspect that area. Grab your wheel, grab your inner tube, line up the valve hole and the valve, and my flat was roughly in this section here. So I'm going to thoroughly inspect this area. If you have some gloves or a rag, I would recommend to use that, or gently and slowly touch the inside of the tire to make sure there's nothing poking through. Okay, nothing on this side. So now let's check the opposite side. Okay, I was roughly about here. I'll do the same thing. Okay. Didn't find anything inside of this tire, so most likely whatever caused the puncture blew out of the tire once the air was escaping the inner tube. If you do find something in the tire, be sure to remove it before replacing the inner tube. Let's replace the inner tube. Now let's grab your inner tube. Remove the valve cap and grab your inflation device to give it a little bit of form and definition. This right here should be enough. And now we can install it onto the wheel. I like to make sure that the label or a label is centered over the valve before I start. Then I grab my valve and I'm going to do the opposite of what we did to remove the inner tube. I'm going to pinch this section and move it out of the way, and then slide the valve into the rim. Then I'm going to grab the tire and I'm going to go over the inner tube like so. Then I'm going to tuck the inner tube into the tire, finishing at the valve. From here, I'm going to grab the tire, pinch it inward, and sometimes you might need to bring this valve a little bit inside of the tire to get this part of the bead to sit in. But from here, I'm going to hold that down and I'm going to start tucking the bead into the rim. So holding this section down, I'm going to start feeding the bead into the tire. I like to stop at the opposite end of the valve to leave that open. And then I'll go on both ends like so. And then roll the tire onto the rim. This tire was pretty easy to install onto the wheel. However, other tires can be a little bit more difficult. I do recommend practicing this a few times, or you can always use a tire lever to put the tire onto the rim. You just want to be very careful doing so, as you can cause a puncture in the inner tube. With the tire bead now installed in the rim, let's just make sure that the inner tube is not protruding out or pinched between the tire and the inner tube. So what I'm doing here is just pinching the tire, moving it out of the way, and making sure that I'm only seeing the inner rim strip, not seeing the inner tube when doing this. If I do see the inner tube, I want to deflate that tube and then tuck it into the tire. And I'll stop again at my valve. Now let's get ready to inflate your tires. On the stock tire of the E-Classic Plus, it takes a maximum of 85 PSI. If you're not using the stock tire, be sure to look on the sidewall for the maximum pressure rating of the tire. All right, so we got to 85 PSI and that was quite a workout. Now let's remove the valve. When removing the valve, we want to pull it straight out and not in an angle, like so. Let's get the front wheel ready so we can install it onto the fork of the bike. Let's talk about the orientation here of this cable. We want this cable in the 6 o'clock position. Then we want to make sure that the washer over here, you'll see that it has a bit of a lip to it, is also in that 6 o'clock position. Then we're just going to open up these axle nuts a little bit more on both sides, put the washers as far out as possible, and then install it onto the fork. With the rotor on the left side of the bike, or the non-drive side of the bike, we're going to lift the front end of the bike up, bring the wheel underneath the fork, make sure that the rotor is centered inside of the caliper, and then the dropouts are over the axle. With the wheel installed on the fork, let's just inspect that everything is done properly. We want the cable at the 6 o'clock position. We want the washer with the lip on the opposite side also at the 6 o'clock position. Washer, then axle nut. You can just hand thread that in. Same thing on the opposite side with the washer, then axle nut. Thread that in by hand. And also the rotor centered in the caliper. From here, we're going to grab our 15 millimeter wrench. I like to tighten the axle nut a little bit on each side until the wrench leaves an impression on my hand. Let's get the bike on the kickstand to hold it up and connect the motor wire. The motor wire is keyed, so just match up both ends and plug them together, like so. These are the steps that are needed to do a flat fix on the front wheel. Now let's get to the rear wheel. If your bicycle is turned on, again, let's make sure it's turned off for these steps. To remove the rear wheel, let's make sure that the bicycle is turned off and our shifter is in gear 1. Now let's remove the belt crank by loosening this bolt back here. We can either use a 5 millimeter Allen key or a 10 millimeter wrench. Once that's loose, we'll grab the belt crank and slide it outward. You just let this hang down here and you'll see a silver pin, which is called the push rod. Grab the push rod and set it aside. Now let's remove the wheel by using your 15 millimeter wrench to loosen up the axle nuts. You want to do the same thing on the opposite side. From here, we'll want to remove the belt off of the rear sprocket. We can do this just by lifting the back end a little bit more, like so. Grab the belt and slide it off. Then grab the wheel and roll it out. And then we can place the bike back on the kickstand. The process to remove your tire and inner tube on your rear wheel is the same as doing it on your front wheel. Check the time code below to see this process. Now that you installed a brand new tube onto your rear tire, let's get the wheel installed onto the bike. Let's first check to make sure our washers and axle nuts are properly oriented. For the axle nut, you just want to unthread that until it gets just about here, which is covering up the last thread of the axle. Then we want to grab our washer and bring it all the way out. For the opposite side, we're just going to unthread this a little bit more. And if you look at this yellow washer, it does have a little tab on here. We want that to be roughly at the 6 o'clock position and butt it up against the axle nut. Now let's get the wheel installed onto the bike. Make sure that the rotor is on the left side with the caliper and the sprocket is on the right side with the belt. Pick up the rear end of the bike and slide the wheel into the frame. Then grab your belt and slide it onto the rear sprocket. If your belt came off of the front sprocket like mine did, we want to slide it onto the front sprocket like so, making sure that the belt is loose. We never want to do this when the belt is tight. Now let's guide the dropout over the axle and make sure that the rotor is centered inside of the caliper. From here, we're just going to finger tight the axle nuts on both sides. I like to put the bike on the ground without the kickstand. Then grab my 15 millimeter wrench, I'm just going to loosen the axle nuts again. Wiggle the wheel in the frame, and this is going to ensure that the dropout is properly over the axle nut. Then grab my 15mm wrench and start tightening the axle nuts. I like to do a little bit on both sides until the wrench leaves an indentation in your palm. Let's put the bike back on its kickstand and get ready to install the push rod. The push rod is directional. You'll see a little red line here, and also the end is flared out. We're going to slide the opposite end in first, inside the axle. With the push rod in, let's grab our bell crank, slide it over the axle, and you want to orient this in a way that the cable has a nice guide to the frame. Then grab your 5mm Allen key or 10mm wrench and snug up this bolt here. No need to crank down on this bolt as it could cause damage to the axle. A step that's not necessary, but always good to check, is to see if the gears are shifting properly. On your shifter, you're going to shift it to gear 2, to gear 3, and then back to 2. When you're done here, the yellow line should be centered between the two white lines, like so. If the yellow line is not centered between these two white lines in gear 2, click on the link in the description below for more information. That's how we fix a front and rear flat on our E-Classic Plus. Before we go riding, do make sure that every bolt that we touched is nice and tight and your tires are inflated to the max PSI. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our information is at the bottom of the screen.